Well, hello there, and welcome, in a sense, to what is Digital Foundry Direct Weekly number 157, our weekly show where we discuss the gaming and technology news of the last 7 days. If it's about gaming, if it's about technology, we shall be discussing it. And joining me to discuss it, first of all, John Linneman.
Hey, Rich, I guess I have to check this off the list here. That's not gaming. The rest is gaming, though. It all looks good.
It's all gaming all the time. Alex Battaglia, welcome back.
Yeah, gone for a little week, kind of busy there with some other stuff, but now I'm here, and you would never notice it, but this camera is tilted. Can you tell?
Now they notice it.
Now they notice it.
You can't tell because you've tilted it to match the tilt of your shelves in the background, so actually it looks fine.
It looks fine. It looks good. Just leave it in. Leave it in.
Yeah, this is fascinating content for our podcast listeners.
Yeah, they don't know what I'm talking about.
But with that, let's begin with our first news topic of the week. So, first news topic of the week, and not much actually happened this week. A range of minor stories we'll be talking about, but one major marketing beat was the first wave of previews for Hellblade 2 from Ninja Theory. The developer, based in Cambridge in the UK, opened its doors to a range of media, including the likes of IGN, GameSpot, Polygon, Games Radar, etc., and GamePro from Germany. Yeah, a whole bunch of people went, not us. But there was a wealth of B-roll material released, and we've got a bit more to appreciate about what this game's about. General reactions to the hands-on seem to be broadly positive, and many are calling this like proper next-gen. Alex, I'm going to come to you first on this because we've kind of not had a huge focus on Hellblade. We've had a couple of trailers. There was the infamous one where you walked in and out of a cave.
Oh yeah,
right.
We're seeing a lot more now, and I'm curious as to your thoughts about this, and also the extent to which we're seeing possibly more of Unreal Engine 5's untapped potential.
Okay, so we are seeing a bit more this time in terms of what I've seen from IGN and GameSpot. Those were the outlets that had video that I saw. The other ones were stills, mainly in their articles, that looked like, I wouldn't say offline rendered, but they didn't look like the same visual quality, honestly, as what I saw in the video form, just because the videos, their encoding, it was really hard to get a sense of like resolution, or just like even generic clarity of the images that we're seeing on screen. It was not well done. I'll talk about that later. But yeah, we see a little bit more of the game. We see a lot more close-ups of the main character. We saw an extended combat sequence that wasn't necessarily unedited in the videos I saw. So I still don't actually have a super great understanding of like what the controller is doing versus what I'm seeing on screen. And that's something that's very different than, for example, like when I watch video footage of Tom or Oliver playing Rise of the Ronin from when they kind of covered it at separate points in time. I had an understanding of what was actually doing what, like controller wise. I could see it. And in the gameplay here, I kind of don't have a good sense of that still, actually, as to what like you control in the gameplay while you're doing combat.
So, you don't really have a sense of the combat mechanics, is that right?
I still don't have a sense of it, no, because when I look at it, I see a number of finishing animations at times. I see what looks like slashing animations, which could be from like tapping X or A. I don't really know. Which I just don't have a really good sense of like what the beats and what you're avoiding, and like, are there like invulnerability frames? Can you block? There's like a lot of things that I just don't exactly know about the combat yet, but I do know, at least from watching the videos and listening to the narration, that there is some sort of like environmental puzzle storytelling. They mentioned like faces that are seen in rock formations that like you look at them, and if you concentrate on them, maybe by hitting a button, I don't know, they disappear and they reveal passageways, or maybe not passageways. Maybe they reveal other things at different points. But the one they specifically highlighted revealed a passageway to continue on forward, where you're probably presented with a dead end, apparent dead end, and then you go forward. So gameplay wise, I know a little bit more about the game, but once again, I'm still like, since they're not showing unedited, just like gameplay with maybe a little bit of narration of the developers showing the game, I still don't actually have a good generic sense of like how the gameplay plays, really, from my perspective. Whatever. Right.
What about the Unreal Engine 5 side?
So here that's interesting. Once again, this is where I unfortunately have to say that I really wish the video production of this preview was better from the outlets where I saw it. IGN encoded their videos at 4K 30, and GameSpot encoded theirs at 1080p 60. So I couldn't get a good sense of anything visually from the GameSpot one. From the IGN one, I got a sense that the game is very, very soft in its presentation. And it's hard to know if that's just because there's a constant, like, immovable depth of field that is, like, affecting close camera objects, or if it was because of I'm looking at YouTube footage of a game, or if I was looking at Xbox Series X footage and I was getting a sense of like what that resolution is like. So the game was very soft in all the moving footage presentation that I saw. And unfortunately in the IGN one too, because they encoded it at 4K 30, and we've seen this before with other footage that is coming out of this game. I don't know if this is because that's the B-roll that's provided, but every camera turn or even just like generic movement of any object on screen is completely non-linear. It's stuttery and juddery all the time, and this is not doing a good way of like showcasing the game. So I would really love to talk about what I saw from Unreal Engine 5 stuff, but the footage provided didn't give me a good sense of those things, and actually it left negative impressions to me. Although the preview talkovers and narration and all the articles were saying, I can't believe the way this looks, this could only happen on next gen. I mean, I can generically see that there's things like nanite being used and lumen and virtual shadow maps just because I know they're there, but I don't actually get a great sense from the video preview that it just needs to be done way better. I don't know how to explain it without being so negative, but like that is just not the way to like show off a game's graphical splendor the way it was presented in the videos I saw.
Okay, we'll talk about the YouTube side of things imminently, but I'd like to get your opinion, John, on what you saw generally.
Sure. I guess the first thing, Alex, I will say in some of these previews when they show other non Hellblade 2 shots, there's also that same judder. So yeah, it doesn't. So I think it's just the video issue. But as far as my thoughts on this are that it looks a lot like the original game, and I can see why if you've I don't remember. Have you played much of the original, Alex?
Yeah, I've beaten it.
Wow. Okay. Because I mean, the combat I thought looked pretty much exactly like that original, where it's very animation priority focused, and they sort of keep HUD stuff out of there. And I think it is probably functionally going to be pretty much the same as Hellblade 1, possibly. I mean, we'll see how it's evolved, but it does seem to function very much like that. And in fact, the whole game does seem to be pretty much a sequel, as the name would imply. I think there was some curiosity that it might take the concept and go further, because the original was famously it was a quote unquote like AAA game made on a smaller budget in a shorter time. And this one is obviously, we don't know the budget, but it has been significantly longer. So I think there was some expectation it might be a larger sort of game, but it's not. And I'm personally okay with that, because I do enjoy smaller games a lot, actually, these days. So it does seem to be a follow-up to the original in terms of the basic mechanics. Like the thing you mentioned about the faces and such, just walking around and looking at stuff, that was all very common in the original, if you remember.
Yeah.
Where you'd like look at certain things and it would trigger something else, and you'd go and look at it again. And I think you didn't even have to press a button necessarily, and it would just like sort of fade away and open the path.
Mm-hmm.
So that stuff looks good. But I kind of agree with you that I think the visuals look extremely good from what I can tell, but it's hard to gauge that much from the preview footage due to issues with the way it's encoded and presented. And it just, man, this is really a problem with video on the internet these days, and that these really dense, visually complex games don't often work well when shown as simple video like this. Right. You know, which is one of the reasons, like when showing fine detail, we have to stop and zoom in, right? Because like not only do people watch on small screens, but the compression issues also sort of mask this stuff, making it impossible to see in a video. Whereas if you're actually playing it on a real TV, you would notice it.
Right.
And
Completely.
I think that's kind of the feeling here. So I'm extremely interested to get my hands on it, because at the very least, there's enough close-ups of the characters so I can say the character rendering looks phenomenal. Some of the best possibly out there. The environments, there's a lot of TBD there. You can definitely see the complexity of nanite and everything. The lighting's very natural and filmic looking. But again, the detail's kind of lost in this video. And given that this is such a heavily visually complex sort of like a focus on visuals, it's a shame we couldn't get like actual proper direct feed capture of this to take a closer look. So we'll be doing that when we get our hands on the final game, I think.
Right. Okay. So I think there's another issue that's sort of coming to the fore here, which isn't exactly gameplay related, but is related to the concept of being able to relay the quality of the visuals to the audience through what is fundamentally a flawed medium, which is low bitrate video. And the issue with low bitrate video is that it's not very good at, particularly at stuff like translucencies and transparencies, because you just get a lot of breakup there on low bitrate video. So I think that's possibly what's going on here.
It could be.
When you're talking about stuff like the camera panning, that says to me it's a 60 FPS capture that's decimated down to 30 FPS.
Exactly.
Which has issues, right? Which doesn't mean to say that the game is running at 60 frames per second, because we'll talk about that in a second. It's not, but you're not getting all of the information from the video stream. It's being cut in half. So if there are discrepancies in the feed, they're amplified by a factor of 2, and it looks bad.
I think that's a key, and I think this is a misunderstanding with people doing internet video. At least a sizable portion of them is that if a game is not 60 FPS, that doesn't mean your video should not be 60 FPS, because fundamentally the consoles output 60 frames per second, 60 hertz by default. A 30 FPS game will effectively display each frame twice, where it basically persists for 33 milliseconds, right? And it's like it's like clockwork. The problem when you throw that into a 30 FPS container is that you're kind of throwing off the mechanism a little bit. And if there's any sort of disturbance in the frame times and the length of time a frame is shown, it starts to introduce judder and skipping. And that's both a function of the video container itself, but also an issue with how YouTube plays back and presents on different devices, which is to say, not as smooth as it should be. So when you combine those two together, you end up with with a presentation that just doesn't look that great on YouTube. I find we put a lot of effort into making sure that we do as good as possible. We try to make it so that it looks as good as it feasibly can within the context of YouTube.
Right.
And that does take some extra work to get right. But because I think things on YouTube can look good, but there is a certain level of setup you need to do in order to ensure the best quality. We're not seeing that here. With a lot of this
we don't know what the quality of the original B-roll assets that went out to the outlets was, and whether they weren't. They might, for all we know, they might have been 60 FPS captures
or
of the
30
FPS games,
30 FPS
or
captures.
30 FPS.
We've seen that before and complained about.
We have.
In fact, we talked. I'm sort of reminiscing about discussions we had about the Starfield B-roll that went out that just didn't look like the game.
That trailer, it was terrible. It was so jerky and choppy looking, and
it actually did an active disservice to the game, which wasn't jerky.
It was not like that at all.
Yeah. Well, there's a really simple way to see how your game is going to look on YouTube. If you're Ninja Theory or Microsoft and you've got these B-roll assets, then upload them to YouTube and take a look at them yourself and see whether you think that is representative of the game. If not, try again. Mm-hmm. But yeah, tricky one. Let's talk about the 30 FPS thing, because this is kind of like a bit frustrating from my perspective, because there's a lot of great information that came out in the Hellblade 2 previews. Unfortunately, once GamePro was translated into English and it was confirmed that the game was running at 30 frames per second with DRS, dynamic resolution scaling, on both Xbox systems, that was actually becoming the trending point on Twitter, as opposed to the all of that great stuff that they did at the studio visit. I just think they should have maybe just confirmed it earlier on, got it out the way, and then the conversation moves on to the new stuff, right?
Right.
What do you think about the concept that the series consoles are running this at 30 frames per second? Because from my perspective, people kind of need to realize that this thing is like 4 years old now. The series consoles, they're 4 years old, and they aren't this mystical box of unlimited performance. They're just not. You've got to have realistic expectations of what a mainstream device can do. And we've talked about this so many times in the past, but if the game was architected for 60 frames per second, that's a design choice, but the game would look very different to what we're seeing here. So, John, thoughts?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is something I've repeated many times, and many developers have talked about time and time and time again. 60 frames per second is a design choice. And I know people love to talk about the hardware and like, oh, they promised this, they promised that, and maybe they shouldn't. But the fact is like when you're deciding to target 60 frames per second, you have to do it early in production for console games, especially because a lot of the decisions made around the art, the way things are built, the pipeline stuff, like you have to decide like, all right, well, we can do this type of artwork. We can do this number of permutations of shaders and like this sort of complex stuff here. But and then if you start seeing your frame rates taking a gigantic hit, if you're not getting the what you need out of it, you can pivot early enough. If you wait until late in the development and suddenly like, we're having troubles, it's a lot harder to fix that stuff because it's like deep buried in the game assets, and there's so much stuff like tied to it directly that makes it hard to walk back. Which is why I think a lot of those, a lot of times when you had games, I mean, we know it's because this was hardware related, the weak CPUs on last gen, but like you'd see them trying to make like PS4 Pro and Xbox One X patches to like uncap the frame rate. And these games weren't designed for that originally, and they would just kind of sputter and struggle. When I think they could have actually been 60 if they'd been architected from the beginning that way. I mean, that's one of the key secrets to like the way id Software works, right? They're all about this, like the frame time is king. The artists are constrained by this to a degree, but it also pushes them to the next level.
Same with Infinity Ward.
Yeah.
And I'd say
many others. And honestly, you know what? I think Sony's actually set a good precedent this gen. They have stuck with in-house technology, and looking at it, it seems as if every single first-party game they've shipped on PS5 runs at 60 frames per second, or has a mode that's 60, and some go above that even. So I have to give them credit to that. That sets a pretty great precedent.
Right.
We haven't seen that on the Xbox. Most developers have opted not to take that approach. And I think the thing about Hellblade 2 that we need to realize is now we know it's been a year or so since we started to see Unreal Engine 5 games shipping with the full feature set intact. It's heavy. Like, whatever they said in the past, whatever Epic was promising, we know now that these things are expensive to use, and the game shipping on consoles using the full feature set of Unreal, there's major compromises that had to be made. Sometimes it's in terms of resolution. I mean, you look at stuff like, I know Lords of the Fallen was like this. A bunch of other games as well.
RoboCop is also pretty
RoboCop's like
60
this
mode.
Like a lot of these things are like, we're seeing 648p, 432p, like obscenely low resolutions to get to 60. And even then they're not a stable 60. So I can understand.
Another one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
like, it's super common. Like, this stuff's expensive. I actually think it could get better in time, but these are games made when Unreal Engine 5 was still very new, and a lot of this stuff is still in development. And I think that's just the reality of what it costs to run this on a console. And I think they decided to target 30 simply so that they could focus more on these visuals. And I think 30 was a design choice for them. And I think to get to 60, you can do it on a PC, of course. And like a next generation machine would be capable of it. I'm 100% certain that if this game were released on PlayStation 5, and it might be, we'll find out, that it would not be 60 FPS. On a PS5 Pro, who knows, maybe, if they were to actually do that. But on the regular PS5, no chance this would be 60. Because that's just the nature of this stuff. It has nothing to do with it being any specific piece of hardware. It's just given the hardware constraints that they have, though, and their design choices, it's a 30 FPS game. And, you know, I mean, I would like 60 in all the games if possible or higher, but I think 30 with good motion blur on a slow paced game like this is probably not a big deal. I do think it's funny that they trot out we want it to be cinematic line. Like, there is a little bit of truth to that. I can see it, but at the same time, that's always kind of like the go-to when they're not able to hit the target. Like, yeah, we want it to be cinematic.
Well, yeah. Hellblade 1 had a bunch of performance modes.
Did it have all those initially? I can't even remember what the first version
I think Hellblade it's on the enhanced machines. Thinking back, I did just take a very quick look at the Hellblade 1 Xbox One X patch video we did, and mostly just to see whether the 30 FPS mode was a proper 30 FPS with proper frame persistence, and it was. So I'm hoping that even if it is... Well, it is 30 frames per second on Hellblade 2. It should be a proper 30 FPS.
A proper 30 is what I've
But we're not getting that from the video, which is, a bit odd.
No, exactly.
So,
the discussion around this stuff is always frustrating because I feel like a lot of people are arguing it from bad faith, where they just...
Oh, absolutely,
It's hard to have a nuanced discussion about frame rate because there's just people that side one way or the other based on whatever their preferred brand is doing, or just based on, I don't know, they're not willing to look at the details and try to understand why things are the way they are and then gauge it on a case-by-case basis. Like, Alex, I think even you could probably at least agree that if you got to be 30 FPS, a game like this is probably about as close to acceptable as it gets, just given the nature of what it is. It's not a fast-paced shooter. It's a slow adventure game.
I mean, I would prefer if it was then like turn-based at that point, but
turn-based Hellblade.
Turn-based Hellblade. Actually, that sounds compelling, like a dungeon crawler.
It really does sound compelling,
dude. That
does
actually
sounds great.
Like a menu-based, like.
Have you ever played Darkest Days? I mean,
oh man, that's a good idea.
I think that's the name of the game. But either way. I think here also another thing is just to look at what Epic said in the past. Like, they say if you use like hardware Lumen, and especially, I don't think these guys are on Unreal Engine 5.4 or 5.5 or whatever, that because it's not out yet.
Yep.
So like Epic in the past have said like, oh, if you're targeting, this is like a 1080p internal resolution, 30 FPS if you use all the features, and they've said that. And the reason why things like Fortnite exist at all at 60 FPS is because just look at the artwork in Fortnite. Like, just look at the density of the game world. Like, look at the quality of the reflections and things like that. If you look, you see the compromises.
Oh, yeah.
A game like this doesn't look anything like Fortnite. It's a lot better looking. So it just all makes sense and it all slides into place. And on something like Series X, that's great. I'm just very curious about, like Rich said, about like the frame pacing, because the assets provided weren't showing that off well. I'm also a little bit curious about resolution, because we've seen that these on Unreal Engine 5 games, it can go pretty low at times, to where if you're using things like FSR, it's disrupting the visual quality of the game. I'm also very curious about the PC version. The previews did mention that they played the Xbox Series X version, at least one explicitly. I believe it might have been... I can't remember who wrote that. It was... it was the Windows one, I think, actually. Maybe it was. That one, I feel like... I'm very curious to see if the PC version has typical Unreal Engine 5 issues. Like, for example, in UE 5.4, which is just released just now to developers to use, I think that the CPU burden was a really big issue to getting games anywhere near 60. So like, even if they provided an unlocked 60 FPS mode here on the Xbox Series X, which is technically doable, all they have to do is just say, don't VSync to 30. The question is like, what does it actually run like, even if they have the resolution scale really lowly? Based on my experience with Unreal Engine 5.3 and lower, it's so CPU slow and has so many single-threaded issues that it wouldn't be anywhere near 60 anyway, and it maybe wouldn't provide a great experience for the player. could maybe provide a great experience for a future Xbox in backwards compatibility mode, which is why there's a good reason to perhaps allow it.
Yeah, they should allow it for that reason.
Yeah, they should probably allow it for that reason. Also, the fact that Xbox supports VRR to very low frame rates is also maybe just another reason to allow it. But yeah, I'm just very curious to see all these things that the preview obviously wasn't about.
Okay. So it sounds to me like the overwhelming reaction is we need to actually see the game, but to be able to pass more meaningful comment on it.
Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah.
I'm really looking forward to it, right? Because, let's assume that the assets aren't great. I mean, therefore you sort of fall back to what people are writing about the game. And, you've got some pretty respected journalists like Ollie Welsh of Polygon really impressed with what they're seeing. So, I'm really looking forward to seeing
what I missed in the did anybody mention the audio? I'm curious if they've brought back the binaural audio.
It's all there.
It's back.
Oh,
it's
heck
back,
yeah. That's for those that haven't experienced it, that's amazing. Binaural audio is basically simulating the exact characteristics of your ear. It's often recorded using like an actual head mic with like little microphones inserted down fake ear canals, and it basically replicates the sound of that your ears would hear. It's basically the best possible surround immersive audio you could ever get.
That was one of the great things about the first game.
One of the few games to do it. There's also Corpse Party that did that.
Right. Sounds great.
What?
Yeah, it was a PSP Vita game back then. Well, I can't remember. I think it was a PSP game, and it also ran on Vita. But
okay.
Okay, well, it's May 21st for the release of Hellblade, so we don't have too much longer to wait. And I did see a comment from Microsoft that there'll be more previews at some point, so maybe we will actually get to see the game pre-review. And with that, I guess that's all we've got to say about this for the moment. Let's move on to our next topic. Okay, so a few weeks back, it was revealed that the PlayStation Portal had been hacked. It's a notoriously limited device because it's simply a streaming platform for receiving remote play information from the PlayStation, when it is actually effectively an Android tablet with a DualSense controller cut in half and stuck to each end. But yes, it was hacked. Android was revealed, and there was a PSP emulator shown running on it. This week, it was revealed that the exploit has been patched, and there was a bit of blowback to the guy who actually disclosed, first of all, found the hack in the first place after about a month of work, and secondly, disclosed it to Sony. Lots of people saying, why did you block off this potential avenue of enjoyment from our portals? I think the bottom line is that, well, his argument was that, well, it's going to get patched anyway. Here's a heads up, don't update your system. And then further to that, there were other things that emerged, like techniques to ensure that you can't update the firmware of the PSP Portal. John, I'm just wondering what you make of this entire scenario.
I mean, it makes perfect sense, I would say, for given the sort of bounties placed on these security flaws. I completely understand. And like you said, he's basically giving us a heads up, like, hey, don't update this thing if you want to potentially do it. I mean, it's interesting because it is a reasonably comfy device to use, but I feel like there's still so many better options out there for like a handheld with a large screen that it's like, kind of who cares? Because it's not like there's a bunch of storage on there, and there's not much you can really feasibly do with it. So it's kind of what I would have expected. What I did discover this week, though, is that this thing has a lot of fans, and I remain baffled by this. That's fine. I mean, I'm happy that people are enjoying it. That's just, wow.
Design-wise, it's a nice device, which I think you said.
It's comfortable. And, I mean, it actually does feel good, and the screen is big. So...
Yeah. And it's bearing in mind it's an LCD, it's a pretty good quality LCD as well, I think.
Better than you'd expect, yes.
Yeah, it's bright, it's vibrant, it's nice. To the point where it does actually show up the issues with the streaming. Quite a bit. There have been reports which are suggesting, hey, everything's got better on the streaming side and whatnot. The issue there is that, I just tried the PC client yesterday, and it's the same as I could tell based on how it was before. And that's the issue with the Portal. You can't capture its output or what it's actually displaying. So any sort of reports on, hey, the image quality has got better, it's going to be really hard to stand that up with empirical data. It's, you know, the amount of times we've seen patches released for anything which bestow upon the experience game-changing improvements, but actually turn out to be exactly the same. It's just, placebo in a sense.
Incredible placebo.
New patch. Yeah, this happens a lot. I was going to have a look at the portal to see whether my own subjective opinions on it had changed, but I kind of don't want to update it now because I want to do some coverage on the exploit when it eventually appears and when stuff actually starts happening on the portal. But it is a reasonably cheap device, so maybe I'll buy another one and take a look at that.
Right.
I think the bottom line is, though, this sort of discourse around the exploit being effectively handed over to Sony and patched in due course. All that does is basically, if he didn't do that, all it would essentially do is just delay the inevitable, which is that the firmware would be updated once the exploit was released, and the end result is you still wouldn't be able to use it as an exploited device. So I don't really see what the fuss is about that. What this does mean, though, is that the security researchers who are actually making these exploits, they are reporting it to Sony. They are receiving significant bounties, sometimes extremely significant when it's a critical security error. But ultimately, without those, it's kind of bizarre because those bounties are actually driving research that actually makes these exploits happen in the first place, as far as I can tell. It's kind of weird, but it is how it is, I guess. Sony must be thinking that it is actually worthwhile doing it because, well, I guess the alternative is maybe there's a sort of less scrupulous player that would look to monetize those exploits in the way that we saw on PlayStation 3, for example. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I am curious about the Portal exploit and what could happen on Android there. There's also something I was talking to Joel about actually, because there's this perception that the screen refresh rate is mismatched to the stream, which is resulting in shadow.
There's a bunch of data out there on that, and it's like it certainly looks that way, but it seems like there's more to it.
Yeah, I mean, I try to replicate this on PC, and yes, if you have your PC monitor updating at 59.94 hertz, it is a markedly different experience to having it updated at 60. It is better, right? But the stutter doesn't go away completely. So I think there's possibly two things going on there. There is the mismatch between the stream refresh rate and the display refresh rate. But I also think there's maybe something happening within Windows, which basically makes the stutter a lot worse on the mismatched refresh rate. And even when it's matched, it's not right. I actually did a test where I actually had our PlayStation 5 capture window running, so the HDMI from the PS5 going straight to a capture tool, and then next to it the PlayStation Remote Player client, and there was a difference in stuttering, but there was also stuttering that was common to the two, even though we know that the PlayStation 5 isn't stuttering itself, which suggests to me part of it is a Windows issue. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's all curious stuff. But, PlayStation Portal exploit, I really want to see what it's capable of. And, the weird thing is, of course, that there are open source alternatives to remote play, which means that, in theory, you may not even lose the ability to stream from PlayStation just by using the open source alternative.
I actually messed with Chiaki on the Steam Deck, and I was like, dang, this actually looks quite okay. It looks good, actually. Like, it's not perfect.
It doesn't improve the stream quality, obviously, although people suggest it does. I actually spoke to the author of the tool, and he said, no, it doesn't.
No, it's just, I think it's smoother, and, I mean, part of it's just down to the screen on the Steam Deck.
Chiaki now supports HDR streaming.
Yeah, that's right.
Which the Portal doesn't.
Exactly.
Wow, that's interesting.
You get that on the Steam Deck OLED.
Yeah, remarkable stuff. Anyway, look, I'm not going to update this Portal. I might buy a second one to actually revisit the device to see if it has.
You show him, Rich.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And we'll go from there. But with that, let's move on to our next news topic. Okay, so obviously we've just had April the 1st. a huge bunch of April Fools, but there is also what you might call the reverse fall. And the classic one being the Asus ROG Ally was announced on April the 1st, and everyone thought it was fake, and obviously it's not, it's real. And John, we had another one, slightly different in scale, but tell us more about this one.
Oh yeah, that's fantastic. I love this. Nightdive posted that they're bringing the classic first-person shooter that debuted on on 3DO, I believe, POed, as it's called.
Okay.
They're bringing it back. They're bringing it back. It's this is such a weird game. Some people don't like it. Audie hates this game. I love it. I think it's fascinating. It's basically like this weird. So you got to think when this thing came out, first-person shooters were still kind of in their infancy, and it's kind of been decided that Doom was the way forward, somewhat, right? And PO's like, well, what if we made everything kind of cartoony and weird? Like your first weapon's like a frying pan, that you whack at people.
Sure.
The enemies are strange, but it's almost more like a first-person platformer, which also seems like a potential bad idea, but it kind of works. It's like this weird, puzzly, somewhat vertical shooter / melee / first-person thing that is so weird and just like otherworldly that it's somehow really engaging. I quite liked playing PO'd. I do have it on 3DO, and it's also on PlayStation, where it runs a lot better, I will say, which is interesting. But I think PO'd on PlayStation is one of the rare games that actually has visual glitches if you play it on a PlayStation 2 in backwards compatibility mode. The sprites get corrupted.
Well, making this remaster by Nightdive all the more essential.
Exactly, correct.
Apparently. Yeah.
But no matter where you played it, the game always had like weird, unstable performance. I mean, it was doing a lot, these really big vertical rooms. Actually, the closest thing I could compare it to is it kind of scratches a similar itch, though not to the same degree of quality as the original MDK, where you're like dropped into these super strange environments. It's got kind of a dark tone to it, but also a weird comedic one as well. And there's just a lot of unusual things that you encounter on your journey, and I think that's cool and fascinating. And now, with thanks to Nightdive, it sounds like we'll be able to enjoy this at a high frame rate with modern controls, which could revolutionize it, and it might make it possible for people that didn't like it originally to enjoy it, because, you know, as a mid-90s FPS game on consoles, you can imagine the controls weren't exactly the most intuitive. It was very much like you turn left and right with the D-pad, you move forward and back. I think you use the shoulder buttons to strafe left and right, and then face buttons for weapons. I think it was pretty much that type of thing, and, you know, that's not the best anymore. Dual analog hadn't yet really been discovered, and dual analog controls didn't really exist when PO'd shipped. So yeah, this should be really interesting. And it's funny, they announced it on April Fool's, and that's a great idea because it's such a ridiculous, unexpected project that it does kind of work as like a joke, and then they're like, April Fool's, but really, we're doing it.
I've actually shown the remaster yet. I mean, the actual tweet video they put out was super low res and blurry, like almost like video of the time.
Oh man, actually, that's a good.
Oh, actually, yeah, it does look like it towards the end of the trailer.
Yeah, they definitely show off some of the gameplay, which I've never played, so I just assumed it was the game.
Oh yeah,
it wasn't something made up at some point.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that's exactly PO'd. Look at that.
Look at that.
But you see, if you look at that footage, you see what I mean, though, right? Like, it's extremely weird. Like, all that vertical stuff, the platforming, the weird leg enemies everywhere. Like, just
I have no problem with first-person platforming. I like it. I'm fine with it.
Yeah, it always had the way the camera moved always kind of had this cool kind of like wobbliness to it that kind of reminds me of what later would be done in Turok. You know, where it's not that stiff. It kind of feels like there's a lot of like waviness to it to try to simulate somebody moving around, and it's kind of cool. So yeah, PO'd, baby, cool. It's back. Get hype.
It was recently announced, but quite a while back now, actually, that System Shock console versions from Nightdive are happening in May, I think.
Yeah, I believe that's right. I think it's getting a physical version too. I think.
Oh, wow. Okay, cool.
Hopefully. And I mean, that's great. System Shock, and apparently just got the latest patch too, which added a bunch of stuff. It improved the ending. I kind of want to see that, because the original ending to the System Shock remake, I guess I would say, It kind of takes place in a separate area than what you've been doing most of the game. It's like a little cyberspacey, but not really the same as the cyberspace stuff either. So it did kind of feel a little bit anticlimactic in a way. And apparently they've completely redone everything about that, which is fascinating. So I'm curious to go back through and see what the heck that's like. Hopefully I can just load a save and jump in.
Figure it out. Yeah.
We'll see. We'll see. But yeah, having that on consoles, that's going to be excellent because that's a phenomenally good remaster that really respects the source material and did not really dumb it down, which surprised me because it's a very complex game. It's a game that I will say, like, if you're playing System Shock and you're like, oh, okay, I'm not going to play System Shock for 2 months, I'll just come back to it later, you're going to be in for a world of hurt because this is a game with like no real objective markers. You got to like actually learn the maps and figure out what the heck you're supposed to do just through poking at the game, which is super rewarding when you're into it, but it does not hold your hand.
Okay, fair enough. Did they say when POed is coming out?
I don't believe so. I think they just announced it.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, fair enough. Yes, it just says here on the VGC news story, a release date has yet to be confirmed. Okay, good stuff. Let's move on to our next news story. Again, John, I'm going to hand this one over to you because a fantastic game has now arrived on MetaQuest 3. You're enthused about it and wish to share that enthusiasm with the world.
Yes, allow me to talk about this. XeSS VRS, the VR reimagining of Cosmic Smash for the Sega Dreamcast and Naomi arcade board. And thanks to one of our viewers, I actually have the Naomi card as well. So I appreciate that. It's pretty cool.
And I've got the Naomi.
I'm trying to get you've got the original Naomi. The Naomi 2 is having technical issues. I never got that to go. XeSS VRS was awesome. Came out on PSVR 2 last year. It was my probably among, if not, I think it was my favorite, most just like the game I played the most that was an original VR game. GT7 I maybe put above it in terms of just, but that's basically an existing game that just has awesome VR support. Where XeSS, I mean, tennis games in VR, they freaking rule. They feel great. There's that table tennis game as well on the Oculus Quest that I love, and Meta Quest that I love. And this is like that scratches a similar itch, but it's more. It's got that super vibey feel of Cosmic Smash, which is kind of like, I guess it's in that same vein as like the original Rez. Well, there is only Rez, but yes. Where it's kind of like spacey, these kind of like very simple shapes and lots of geometry, but you're like basically playing, it's not exactly tennis, it's more like squash, I guess. But there's like, you can either play against other players and you're trying to take out the shapes behind them, or you play the single player stuff, which is like, dealing with lots of different patterns across the field and trying to angle the ball to hit those patterns and stuff. But it just feels awesome. The combination of the music, the VRness, I loved it. And I liked it on PSVR 2 a lot. Problem is, of course, PSVR 2, it's wired. My space back here is somewhat more limited than I would have liked. So some of that's just dealing with your own personal house setup. But being able to take the Quest and just like go out on the patio or down into the living room, it really sort of frees it up, if you know what I mean. And it felt like I could run back and forth freely within that space. Like out on the patio, I was able to actually, I could play just by physically running back and forth, which felt really cool. In a way, it's just,
I would love to see some paparazzi video of that, John.
Oh no, that would be bad. But I'm really happy that it's on the Quest, and it's a perfect Quest sort of game in the sense that, like, and one of the things I love about it is you play a few rounds, you take off the headset, you set it down, you come back later, like, I got 10 minutes, you just put the headset back on, and it's like a handheld gaming system. You just hop in and out
like
of VR
Tetris
whenever you want.
That way.
Yeah. And as a result, it's just, I feel like it's the perfect format for it. And actually, a lot of the PSVR 2 stuff's been coming over. I also have been recently messing with Humanity as well, which was another game I loved on PSVR 2 last year. That's out on the Quest as well now. And again, because there's no wire and it's standalone, it makes it a lot easier to sort of move around. You're like a giant within that sort of city block environment, guiding your peoples it just works really well.
Good.
Although, I mean, I got into some arguments over that. Some people were very angry about the way I talked about PSVR 2 recently.
I did see that.
Holy moly, they were mad. And it's like, bizarre. Listen, I still like the PSVR 2. I think it's a cool piece of kit. It's just, for me personally, like the benefits of the Quest, like it's transformative in terms of how I use VR.
There is an interesting debate to be had here because, as was pointed out in that tweet thread, the definition of bias now has sort of migrated into something much larger than what it actually means.
Yeah, exactly.
And rather stupidly, people are interpreting bias to mean a preference of one over the other.
Exactly.
When one can be objectively better than the other, it doesn't matter. You're biased. That's just nuts.
Exactly.
It's like,
what's the point?
Yeah.
It's not like PSVR 2 doesn't have some advantages, right? But some of those, it's a trade-off thing. Like the screens, for instance, it uses OLED screens, so you get better black levels, and it can do the HDR. Right. The trade-off, though, is that when you use OLED in VR, you can't do the essentially strobing, black frame insertion, kind of like low persistence stuff to the degree you can on an LCD because it impacts the brightness too greatly. And if you're trying to do HDR as well, so basically the PSVR going for that high dynamic range presentation means that the motion clarity sucks. It looks like a normal flat panel. There's tons of persistence blur versus the Quest, which is basically they use LCDs, but they're able to drive it in a way that you basically get CRT quality clarity. It is perfect motion. There is no blur in motion, which looks phenomenal in VR. And since you move your head all the time, to me, that matters a lot. That completely changes the presentation. But obviously that also means you don't get the black levels. It's LCD, so black areas are going to glow. There's black backlight glow. So it's kind of like, do you want motion clarity or do you want the brighter HDR? In the black levels. And I can, normally I would prefer both, and you can do that on OLED screens, on monitors, TVs, but I think just the way it works in VR, I've yet to see any OLED based VR headsets that can do the same motion clarity that you get with the Quest. But honestly, the Quest 3 is just absurd in terms of motion clarity. Like, it's really the best I've ever seen.
That's awesome.
I think that is awesome on there. Also, again, pancake lenses. I mean, it's just what a difference that makes for me, at least. Like, it's just that edge. Yeah,
these are objective things. They're like literally researched things that people put a lot of money and time into. It's not a bias. It's a technical spec that's better. It's fine to prefer that too. Like, John, just ignore it all.
It's interesting to hear like how, and I understand if you spend a lot of money on this stuff, you're gonna be passionate about it. But I mean, I think in my collection, I have like 9 VR headsets now. I've used a lot of VR headsets. I spent a lot of time in VR. I like VR a lot. And I do think they all have their pros and cons. There is no perfect headset. My only point was that the Quest 3 is probably the closest we've gotten to that. It still has its flaws. It is definitely not perfect. But, you've got to give and take. Like, if you're looking at the more traditional wired style VR, although it has wireless coming, I mean, I would say the Pimax Crystal massively outperforms PSVR 2, but guess what? It's like 3 times the price. So it should. That's the wired headset right now. It's got a much wider FOV. It's got super good black levels, way higher resolution, better lenses, like all of that stuff. But that's the sit down. This is a big, heavy thing on your head kind of experience. So again, sacrifices. I just think for my money, the Quest 3 is just the most flexible and closest thing to the best product on the market. And I do think wireless PC play as well. Like, the native games are amazing, but wireless PC play just pushes it over the edge. It's just like, because it's so easy to use, like, there's less setup to use wireless PC playback than it is to plug in the PSVR 2 and get it going.
That's crazy.
I'm not kidding. It's that easy. It's literally just click a button and you're just like in. And it's nuts. Like, I cannot believe how seamless it is.
Yeah, I think we should highlight here that you are actually endorsing a streaming video solution.
I'm endorsing a streaming solution
John
that uses an LCD.
Videos. Yeah.
It's an LCD-based streaming system, and I'm like, I'm endorsing this. That should say a lot. I don't.
That's amazing. Ruling out your existing biases.
Exactly. This is the opposite of what I like. OLED on the PSVR 2. physical media is available for some PSVR 2 titles. Like, there's so many reasons why I would normally prefer the PSVR 2 and want to prefer it, but in reality, I'm basing this on just the actual product experience, and I mean, that's just how it is. I think the Quest 3 is better.
Fair enough.
But again, that doesn't mean I hate the PSVR 2. I still like it.
It doesn't automatically mean that the PSVR 2 is rubbish.
It does not. The PSVR 2 is a great headset still. Of the traditional wired type of headsets, it is absolutely on par or superior. I think it is actually better than, like, say, like a Valve Index, for instance, which is an older VR headset. It's that type of headset, but it's a bit better than that. But that's, again, there's so many different headsets. There's so much to evaluate there, and there's still a ways to go. Like, I would love a much more, like, field of view. What we talk about isn't the same as, like, the amount of visible space, like, in terms of the coverage. Like, you still have the goggle effect on pretty much all headsets.
Right.
And in fact, actually, I didn't mention it yet, but I did very briefly sample an Apple Vision Pro. I do not own one of those. I will not own one because it's insanely expensive. I can't afford that. And it's not actually that interesting to me because it's not really a gaming headset, but it does look great, but it's actually got like a slight softness to it that the Quest 3 does not have. And it has the same issue as PSVR 2. It uses micro OLED screens and it has tons of persistence blur.
Okay.
Interesting.
So it looks so good, like it does, but like I feel like it's almost like slightly out of focus intentionally to like make it so you can't detect any pixels or sharpness in the edges. So it's kind of a softer presentation, yet still noticeably very high res. But between that and the persistence blur, I was like, there's definitely some weirdness to it. So
weird. Yeah.
Okay, Smash rather. I did read it's going 2D as well.
Oh, that's right. They announced a 2D version. So, I mean, the original is obviously an arcade/Dreamcast game, right? So it makes sense that it could be playable in 2D, and it seems like that's happening. So,
okay,
yeah.
Okay, that's all we've got to say about that. Let's move on to our next topic. So this week, no video from Alex because he's been spending some time doing some research. Recently, Intel announced PresentMon 2.0, latest benchmarking tool with some additional new variables in there that should help us better understand the way games are performing on PC. We took a look at a video from Gamers Nexus which used this tool to assess performance on Dragon's Dogma and thought, hey, this has got a lot of potential here. But obviously we'd like to put our own spin on it. And Alex, why don't you tell us about what you've learned about PresentMon 2.0 so far and the extent to which it could change how you would like to present data and analysis on Digital Foundry?
So what I've learned so far is I've been using PresentMon 2.0's, originally the beta version, and then they just shipped the live version like yesterday, which was nice. And it had a couple of other changes as part of it. What I've been using is the OSD, the on-screen display there. Much like you have with RTSS or with Chaldean's, I always forget the name of it, John.
Special K.
Yeah, Special K. Sorry, Special K. You've got the ability to like have a good understanding of like frame metrics and things like that run in real time, usually superimposed over your screen in some way. The way it does it in PresentMon 2.0 is it a separate, clear window that you can drag and drop anywhere you really want to, which was nice because I was doing it in a funny way where I was recording the game in our traditional way where it's hooked up into a capture card, beamed straight into a recording PC essentially, and then we record from there. That's how we do all of the DF footage more or less. At least I do. John has a slightly different setup.
Yes.
But for me, I did that, but I also hooked up a second capture card and I was dual monitoring out of the PC where the game was being played on. And on the second monitor of this dual monitor setup, it was also going into another capture card on my PC. And that was only showing the OSD metrics from PresentMon 2.0. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because I think we want to evolve our hardware reviews. And I also want to evolve personally, just the way I look at games on PC to have like a more in-depth understanding of like why a frame is running poorly, like why a game feels like it's running poorly. For a game that is running fine, you don't need actually a ton of metrics to say why it's running fine. You don't. Honestly, that's not the story at that point. So it's a lot of extra work and maybe hassle to get data that you're not going to use. But in the case when a game isn't running well, like for example, The Last of Us Part 1, Jedi Survivor, Dead Space, these are games I looked at. Well, I didn't look at TLOU Part 1 because I just kind of didn't feel like loading it up with that extremely long shader compilation time. But I did look at the other games, and I wanted to like have a better understanding of what is going on. And so I made some recordings, and these are very basic and ugly. So I'm very sorry about that. I'll tell you what about the nth goal, like the nth degree goal here is after this. But so like if we go back to our original coverage of like Jedi Survivor, we know that game has big like frame time stutters and spikes in it, and they are measurable to a great degree. But when you are measuring them, you are just kind of measuring the end output of what you see on the screen. On the screen, it honestly looks worse than a normal frame time spike, I would argue. But also you don't have any really great context as to like what is happening in that moment. You can just have guesses based upon things like GPU utilization, but it's not a great, clear understanding why. It's with PresentMon 2.0 and the new way they calculate frame time there with like a new marker event that says like this is where the frame actually starts, it is so accurate. It is incredibly accurate. I actually think it is very well done. Bravo to Intel and bravo to the makers of PresentMon 2.0. So what you're seeing here on screen should be footage of Jedi Survivor running at like 1080p VSync with ray tracing off. And back when I did my like update on the game, I said, even if you run the game with VSync on and you're getting like a perfect output 60 FPS, the game is still going to show off animation errors that explode, and it makes it look like the game is dropping frames, but really there's actually 60 unique frames at each and every second. Well, here you'll see on the bottom right is our normal frame time graph. In this case, it's running actually our console tools, which look at whether or not frames are repeating. Here it's actually showing pretty much perfect. There's like one dropped frame here or there, one double frame, but like it's actually should be like, wow, we would usually say this is a great running game. Subjectively though, we know it isn't. It looks bad on screen. And if you look at the CPU, I believe it's called CPU busy, frame graph that I hear of superimpose over it, you'll see that it is showing a lot of up and down, valleys and hills and mountains of moments that actually coincide 100% with animation stutters as found in Jedi Survivor. This is showing us that we are getting better information than just looking at the game's raw output on a screen that can be programmatically read off. Like with if we ran FCAT in this exact same here too with VSync on, it would show us the exact same problem in the bottom right there that we don't see actually the frame drops. This is very important to us because one, it gives us greater information about what the issue is here in this game. It's a CPU related issue. CPU frame times are spiking. They're causing a messed up issue with the animation playback, and also the frames being put back perhaps in the wrong order. There's still a little bit to know more there, but we get better information than what we had before. And you just, like, I don't know how to explain it, but like for DF videos, we have to constantly record everything with VSync on because we want to provide a good viewing experience to people making our videos. If I recorded things like the way maybe other outlets might do it, when I put this footage next to console footage, everyone would think the PC footage looks bad because it would have improper frame pacing. Maybe it would be like in the wrong container if I was using things like Shadowplay, NVIDIA Share, etc. to record these things. Recording non-locally on a recording PC using VSync is the best way to get the best visual quality for our output videos. This allows me to get even more information out of a game than I otherwise would have had in the past while doing our exact same recording practices. So we're getting a better understanding now of like why the game doesn't look smooth, and we can point at individual objects in the PC that are the problem. if I superimpose a graph here of that exact same footage I just showed you now, where GPU wait is visible there, I believe it's called, or GPU busy, GPU busy, you'll see GPU busy here is actually showing the amount of time that the GPU is active and doing things. And it's actually an incredibly small portion of the overall frame time. And you'll see that it does not have these large spikes in it, unlike CPU busy. So the CPU is spiking out. And that's where we know the issue of the frame time is coming from. It's beautiful. There's no guessing here anymore. There's no pointing at a utilization statistic and saying, well, I guess. So this is all really good for my future videos covering games that are problematic. For games that are less problematic, it's actually a step too far, I would argue, and maybe it is a time sink that isn't completely necessary from just looking at the game in our standard way. But this is great for games like Dragon's Dogma 2 that have issues, like Jedi Survivor, like T-Loop 1, like Dead Space. I did the same test with Dead Space and I found the exact same conclusions. It's all really great. The nth degree goal of this, though, is not to have this like super ugly superimposed video that I'm doing here. It's hideous. It would actually be something that Rich is also very interested in. And this is basically, we're going to use the recording functionality of PresentMon 2.0, taking the data that it spits out, and we're going to plug it into our graphing system.
Yeah, we're going to enhance the graphing system basically because I think, ultimately PresentMon, here's the thing, right? Let's say you're capturing your game and while you're capturing, you want a holistic view of everything that's happening with the system. So you would have a lot of graphs on screen, right? Which is kind of what we saw in the Gamers Nexus Dragon's Dogma review, right? Which is that, they had amazing analysis and statistics. But when you're actually looking at the captures, there's a lot of graphing on there. And then what they did was to cut out and then enlarge the one that they're actually talking about. I just want something that's more easily passable and manageable to the more mainstream viewer, that actually emphasizes the stuff that we're talking about. And what that means is picking and choosing which metrics to show and where, and then producing a visualization system that actually works to make that obvious, to the more obvious, I would say, to the layman. And Alex has kind of come up with a interesting half solution there, which was to run those graphs on a secondary screen, capture that, and then basically cut and paste those graphs onto the main footage there. The issue I have with that is that you can't really it's extremely difficult to do competitive analysis at that point. Let's say that it's a driver issue between AMD and NVIDIA, one or the other has driver issues that would manifest in the PresentMon data. Ideally, you'd want to show them in the traditional versus scenario, right? Which you couldn't really do there without it being like two separate graphs that are being composited on. There's a lot that we want to do with this data to actually showcase it in a more pleasingly attractive and easily absorbable manner. And this extends to GPU reviews, right? Because, there's so much data that's going on here within PresentMon that you want to pick and choose what you want and then compare it to the competition. So here's a classic example that that we should be doing and we can do with this new data. You can look at like an AMD and a graphics card from NVIDIA that are effectively offering identical performance, and the perception that the user comes away with is that, okay, well, they're effectively the same. But what if you have a secondary graph that is showing power consumption where the differences will be a lot more pronounced? You're getting a more holistic view of the capabilities of the cards, and not just performance, but also efficiency as well. You could also graph performance per watt, of course, into an all-in-one sort of presentation, which would look very, very different. You could have, there's just so many different things that are going on here, even CPU utilization.
That's the one I wanted to talk about. Like, I couldn't do it for this because the OSD does not have per core CPU utilization as a graph on its own right with like bars and stuff, which would look beautiful. But with the data that it spits out of the record functionality, we can make that actually. And we could show, like, in these moments when Jedi Survivor is having its little sputters, we could probably show the CPU utilization of a single core just going insane to like 100%, while the other ones are much smaller in those moments. And we would see the issue like perfectly on screen, lining up with the footage, being per frame. It would inform the user. It would inform the way a game is patched. like if we could show these things and we could talk about them more easily, it's really good.
The other thing about having the versus stuff integrated into the visualization isn't just to do like AMD versus NVIDIA. It can be launch version versus day one patch. There's all manner of reasons why you would want to have comparative data on the same graphs, which PresentMon doesn't really do. It's kind of capturing one system at one point. So, huge potential there to basically change everything in terms of how we look at games and how we can present that. But I do recommend watching the Gamers Nexus review for Dragon's Dogma 2, because it gives you some idea of how the data can be analyzed and expressed to the audience in a way that we haven't really been able to do before. You're kind of almost sort of, it's almost sort of guesswork. The great example Alex came up with there is, okay, you're looking at one core spiking and you're kind of presupposing that that's the issue, whereas PresentMon is actually giving you CPU time in milliseconds, which, is completely unambiguous. So this is all really exciting stuff, I think.
Oh, it's incredible.
Yeah, it's really exciting to see Intel. It'd be nice to see Nintendo doing this, but Intel are basically grasping the nettle. I think what's also interesting about it is that, traditionally benchmarks are being used for hardware reviews. And as we discussed a few weeks ago when this was first revealed, I actually think this is still more useful for game reviews rather than hardware reviews.
Yeah, that's the key. Yeah, because, I agree with that. Yeah, right now, like figuring it, like the current metrics that are given out, like it gives us a greater understanding of a game. But like creating sort of a paradigm or a number or a perfect chart that you can apply across a variety of games. We're talking about like 20 to 25 games for like a hardware review. It's I don't know, that's harder. That requires even more philosophy at that point.
Yeah, good stuff. And with that, let's move on to our next news topic. Not so much a news topic, but more an appeal.
Yes.
Basically, a fantastic video went out this week from Accursed Farms. Basically, the Stop Killing Games campaign. I mean, the game that was brought front and center within that content was The Crew from Ubisoft, which is going to effectively cease functioning this year.
Already did.
Somebody
captured the final moments of The Crew, which is fun.
The final moments of The Crew.
Basically, there are ideas here, a manifesto of sorts on what can be done to actually stop this sort of thing happening. Alex, do you want to take up the mantle on this one?
Yeah, I was inspired by this, but I think it's a topic that everyone at DF really cares about. It's basically ownership of games being like when you buy a game, it is immutably yours. Kind of like when you buy hardware, it's immutably yours. Like, I feel like that is very important. It's something that is not exactly, since we're buying licensed software, as it's called, and since we're buying hardware that like through EULAs, like end user license agreements, as well as like little stickers on the boxes, they technically limit our legal use of these things, which haven't been basically the only reason why these exist, because companies put these words on there, and since they're businesses, you have to agree with them to buy the product in the first place. But are they actually legal? And the question then is like, has anyone questioned the legality? Has anyone actually brought this to court to see whether or not these practices are legal? And the answer is pretty much no regarding a lot of this, which is why it happens. If it's gray, then you can do it, more or less. And with the Crew, it's an interesting example of a very long history of examples of a game being, you bought it legally, you paid a certain amount for that, or maybe you got it free, I have no idea. What other way? You have a license to the game, and after a certain amount of time, it is shut off. For example, like the Crew, it's actually been a number of years since the game out, but there's games that shut off and stop existing like within a few months. what was that one game from Platinum recently?
Oh, Babylon's Fall.
Babylon's Fall. You have like that boss key game. I can't remember.
Lawbreakers.
Lawbreakers.
Well, I have a physical copy of Lawbreakers still sealed.
That's amazing. It does almost nothing right now.
I need to get Cliffy to sign it.
Yeah, Cliffy's going to sign Lawbreakers for you. But there's a lot of games that just come out and stop existing. And the reason why this is bad is because you bought this game. It would be great, regardless, 10 years down the line, if you could still play it. Yes, maybe no one is in a populated server, but you can at least load up the game and see like the graphics and play it. Or maybe you could organize a group of friends to LAN it, or you can organize a group of friends over the internet to play it together in 10 years' time. If they take a game offline, as in there's no like infrastructure that allows you to connect to play anymore with your friends, or even just get past a login screen, then you have a dead game and it's nothing. It's dead software at that point. And this great campaign here that was a lot of research, and there's an entire website that you should go to, stopkillinggames.com. Is basically set up like a framework so that you can leverage your local government resources or international government resources to complain about this. And then the chance that it is brought up in some sort of legal procedure or a law is made about this because there's enough consumer complaints, well, it increases rather rapidly. Depending on your country, it's going to be different everywhere you go. This website you should go to, stopkillinggames.com, will lead you through it in your own language. And you'll choose like your country that you live in the beginning. And you can basically complain about, very specifically in this case, about the crew. So the chances are you need to own the crew. I own it. I think a lot of people who actually have Ubisoft have the crew, Ubisoft Connect. I think it was given away at some point even. So yeah, you can complain about this. And the reason why we want this to happen, and I think you really should look at this, is because it can set a legal precedent about what happens after a certain amount of time. It doesn't mean the developer necessarily has to like support the game forever, but it will change the way maybe games are made in the future so that there's a way for a game to exist even after a publisher stops supporting it. So stopkillinggames.com, you can read up on it there. It's very friendly. The information's great. Please check it out.
John, what are the realistic ways of preserving games like The Crew, which, basically I'm assuming are running on economically unsound server infrastructure because barely anyone is using them?
I mean, I think that's the key there, is that they need to be able to turn over that server stuff to the community to allow them to sort of take ownership of it, and do what they will with it, basically. Because right. Yeah, Ubisoft doesn't want to pay the money to run the servers. Well, let someone else take a crack at it. I think that's completely fair. Like if they have no intention of making money from it, and I know with these large corporations, that's often the thing, right? It's like if they can't make money from it, nobody's allowed to touch it, is often the mentality. And that's why this is the kind of stuff that needs to be fought in court to basically change that. Because then fundamentally, if that is challenged and actually a change happens, that could also cause developers to rethink the way they tackle these types of games and their end goal for them, if they know that they need to comply with this by law.
There could be, in theory, the addition of a built-in offline mode. Yeah,
bring back LAN play.
Right, my
goodness. Just straight up like LAN options. That was amazing. I remember, I played a lot of LAN games with my old roommate, and I think Gears of War 2 came out, and we got it, and we did play it, but I think it was the first game where it was like, oh, you can't LAN this game anymore. I think that was the one. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was that, where it's like you have to go through Xbox Live, which at the time we shrugged and just did it, but it was like that was the moment around then. I remember it being a big step back, where you used to be able to just connect the two together, just have your own local thing and just do it. And then they took it away, and it's been gone pretty much since then.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Alex, what are the other sort of preservation techniques that are being suggested here?
Well, I guess one would be an offline mode. Not very doable for all game types. So I think that one is a little bit... It's really more game specific at that point. Perhaps like the compliance with a law would allow that as one of the possible like outcomes for a game. I think the other one that John just mentioned is the master server architecture being handed over to an audience, and it could literally just be like a big code dump of like how this is set up, and it's all like here be dragons, and that's fine. I actually think that's fine. Because if a community is dedicated enough, there's enough people to actually want to get that up and running. Right. And I guess maybe another one would be the actual LAN option too, or to, as part of the game, like old games, there's no matchmaking, to allow people to host their own dedicated servers, which is another thing that I think is weird that it's gone from most games. Like, I actually do not like matchmaking unless it's a competitive game. I actually like connecting to a dedicated server, like 24/7 DE-2 or something like that. Like, I find because you happen upon regulars and you know names after some time, communities grow. With matchmaking, the community is like a Discord group, maybe, that just, it's very different. But I would like the idea also as another alternative is when a game comes out, there's a dedicated server SDK that is shipped with the game to just run it on your own PC. And some of these dedicated server things that games did in the past was just literally just like a bat file that you double click and you're running a server. It's not so complex. It's incredible that games don't ship with this anymore, but so it is.
I mean, they want you to subscribe to services, everything's services these days.
Yeah. There's a lot of gray areas here too, like what happens with DLC. These are other things, like, because you can buy DLC, but then it just disappears. Like, you bought it. I don't know.
Oh yeah, that's the worst.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot to be said about this. Just try and support it if you please can.
Okay, one more shout out for the URL.
Oh yeah, stop killing games with a double G there, because killingandgames.com. Yeah, stopkillinggames.com.
All right, okay, good stuff. Let's move on to next topic. Alex, it's with you again. Interesting disclosure from Intel. They've updated XeSS to version 1.3, and it seems to be based around more advanced AI model. And yeah, some interesting stuff going on here in terms of scaling, right?
Yeah, so the model 1.3, Intel's been improving it since it came out. This time, the demo, the example they show on their website was mainly about, like, I don't know, I'd call it like the texture resolution is too high, and it looks like Z fighting, but it's really like moire patterns going nuts as the sub pixels there, like, it doesn't know how to rearrange it into a good stable image because there's just too much detail. And here it's stabilizing it, it's completing the detail while not over blurring it.
It's not perfect,
but it's better,
but it's vastly improved.
Yes. And this was actually something that I showed off in my original XeSS video that could happen in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I pointed it out as a difference between it and DLSS, whereas otherwise XeSS was extremely competitive. I actually thought it had better motion handling than DLSS in that game, as I pointed out back then. But so that's one part of it. The second part is new modes for scaling. Typically, let's just take a 4K here, like 4K quality mode for DLSS is 1440p. Then balance mode is like 1254 or 1296p. I always forget. Maybe 1265p or something like that. Weird. And then the performance mode is 1080p, and ultra performance mode, which not every game supports, is 720p at that point. That's like, these are very like you have a lot of variation there between like quality, balanced, and performance, and you can get a good sense. Like, you can actually, those are great. But when all of a sudden you go from 1080p down to 720p in ultra performance mode, and that is a huge gulf in resolution. And Intel's saying, actually, let's add more variation in there. So they've done a rearrangement of things where they used to have ultra quality mode, which was like 1792p or something like that. Quality mode 1440p, balance mode 12 whatever p, and then 1080p was performance mode. Now they've busted out a whole new bunch of them, and they've rearranged it where now performance mode is like 900p, and the old performance mode is now balance mode, and the old quality mode is now balance mode, and then the new quality mode is the ultra. Wait, sorry, I'm getting confused myself. Look at this graph. that I put on screen right here. Sorry, Oliver. Basically, they've rearranged
the performance is still 720p.
Yeah,
they never had ultra performance.
They never had it before, to be fair. But the new performance mode is now lower, and then they have an ultra quality mode plus for the old ultra quality mode. This is just more variation in there so people can choose their performance and image quality level better than just 4 options, essentially. And also there's a native mode here, which is also new to XeSS.
The DLA alternative.
Yeah, and I like this a lot. I mean, my preferable thing would actually just be a percentage slider.
Yeah.
Because I'm a power user. But for the non-power users among us, this is a better, more like predefined way to get a sense of things. The only confusion that I see now is maybe reviewers may not know this is happening, and they'll put the XeSS version to performance mode, and they're like, gosh, this is running so much better than FSR2 performance mode.
Yeah, or DLSS.
Or DLSS for that matter. So I'm excited about this. I would love to look at XeSS again very soon. In fact, we're kind of due for that anyways when FSR 3.1 comes out.
Yeah.
So in the next couple months.
DLSS as well. DLSS 3.7.
3.7. All these things, they're at least evolving. I complained not too long about a while ago that FSR2 and DLSS had gone a little stagnant. So to see them evolving is exactly what we want. And in the case of these ML model ones like XeSS and DLSS, it's kind of like the one virtuous cycle that they have in them. That's really great. Just more training and better training leading to better results. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about it because we talked about FSR3 before. We should talk about XeSS, and this is a very good evolution. I would like to see the other IHVs here, like AMD and NVIDIA, add more than just the current modes they have. A little bit more variation.
So with DLSS, you can obviously swap in new DLLs and bring new quality enhancements to older implementations. Is that the case with XeSS?
It has DLLs, but I've never drag and dropped them to check it out because there's been so few versions. There's been like the 1.0 version is the one I don't think actually that shipped with DLLs. The 1.1 definitely had a DLL. 1.2 was just the support for DRS. I don't think it changed anything in the model. And then this is the first larger model update they've done. So, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Excellent. Great stuff. Okay, next up, let's tackle Supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where every week we petition our supporters on our Patreon, at patreon.com/digitalfoundry. We ask for questions for inclusion in the various editions of DF Direct Weekly we put together. We choose the best, or rather the ones that we're best equipped to answer. And we're going to kick off with this one from Colin Robinson. And he says, "Hello, sirs. Would it be more practical to target 1440p 60 FPS in performance mode than 4K 60 FPS? I can understand quality mode being focused on 4K for a lower frame rate, but it seems to me that 1440p would require less of a sacrifice to image quality. Pardon if that is already the case. Also, John, if present, Saturn launch DF Retro when? Thank you and have a great weekend! ! Alex, it's a good idea, and it's kind of already happening.
It's kind of practice. I mean, you look at a lot of the Sony titles. It's kind of like that. Like The Last of Us does that. I know. I also looked at Skull and Bones recently. I had to think of the name. Yeah. Skull and Bones. That was also
Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora.
Avatar does it too.
Yep.
So does Alan Wake 2.
Yep.
Output is 1440p. How they get there is a question. Obviously, different games like The Last of Us is like native with TAA. Other ones are with FSR2, for example, to get up there to 1440p. But it is a great idea in general anyways, because 4K leads to a lot of really huge spikes to different aspects of the GPU. Like bandwidth is much more constrained at that point. Things like post-processing effects and like transparencies at 4K are much more expensive. So it's just like a much more controlled way to prevent large GPU spikes by lowering the resolution. And it is a great way to do it. And if you're doing it on PC, for example, you can also get away with it in a lot of games really well. A lot of newer games now do not reset your monitor resolution, but they just upscale internally. And a number of them actually keep the HUD at 4K. Recently,
I like that.
That's interesting. I saw it. Oh, I just saw it in Horizon. If your monitor's set to 4K, the game will take your internal resolution and just upscale that pre-HUD, which is like the way it's done on console. It's an interesting concept, and I actually like it quite a bit. So yeah, you can do it on PC and console, and everyone, games do it all the time. And as Oliver says, like, if you're standing far away from a screen, 1440p with good TAA can look pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting point. And yeah, it's just a good idea generally. And the concept of actually having a 4K HUD as well is kind of like the icing on the cake, because that's the one thing that does sometimes get overlooked. But the advantages are, and was actually, we've had a very similar question in the past, but one of the advantages we didn't point out at the time is that, there's kind of like a processing footprint on stuff that needs to be done at your output resolution. And obviously that processing footprint is lower if it's 1440p, much lower than it is if it at 4K. So you're kind of like balancing upscaling artifacts versus the blur of more traditional upscaling. But you can actually get a pretty good result. And Avatar Frontiers of Pandora is a game that kind of works for me because it does target that 1440p output with reconstruction, but at the same time it's also running dynamic resolution scaling. So, it's putting a ceiling on how far it pushes the GPU, and if it's falling short, it just scales down resolution and then tries to use FSR2/3 spatial upscaling to make up the difference there. So yeah, that's a pretty good way to do things, I think. And often it isn't the best way to just always target a 4K output with your reconstruction for various reasons, because as Alex says, some of the post-processing stuff needs to be done at native resolution, and the load of that can vary dramatically. So it's an interesting balance between reconstruction and more sort of standard upscaling.
Right.
Any thoughts, John?
Not really. I mean, beyond what you guys have said, just
you've got to have some thoughts about the Saturn launch DF retro.
Oh well, I will comment on that, and yeah, that would be pretty good. I wouldn't mind doing that. Just as because I've done PlayStation, we have a N64 thing in the works, and then Saturn would be nice as well. The launch for Saturn, I mean, the actual lineups are quite small, so it wouldn't be that difficult. Although I feel like the early Saturn stuff is so well covered by the excellent Pandemonium that I would recommend anybody hungry for Saturn to go check out his stuff too. But that's he kind of goes into a different perspective on it, but that stuff's amazing, and I recommend that for sure. But yeah,
you actually get good output from a Saturn for capture purposes these days.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you just pair a good quality RGB cable with like a RetroTink 4K, especially.
Right, of course, it's 240p.
Yeah, you get a really clean, nice output. Granted, there's plenty of interlaced content as well, but also Mike has been busy updating the Tink's motion adaptive deinterlacing, and it's like light years better than it used to be, and it was already amazing. So it's nuts.
Mm-hmm. Japanese launch would be a bit threadbare, though, wouldn't it?
The American too. The American launch is pretty thin. There's not
European.
I actually don't know what the European launch was.
I think it was a bit more robust if you were opening it up to a kind of like launch window. But,
right. That's what I'm doing for N64 is we're doing N64 year one, because N64 had few enough games where doing the entire first year of N64, there's still less games than just covering the entire launch of PlayStation.
Mm-hmm.
So,
cool. Okay. Hopefully that answers everything Colin asked us there. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Roach. Hi DF, why do you think games like Dragon's Dogma 2 can't run at 60 FPS on console? We're told it's a quote-unquote next-gen game and that it's CPU limited, but when I see games like Assassin's Creed Unity running on Xbox Series X with way more NPCs on screen, a Plague Tale Requiem's perf mode with 300,000 rats on screen, or even the upcoming Kingmakers having 60 FPS as the focus, I fail to see where all the CPU cycles are going. Most of the NPCs in the cities of Dragon's Dogma 2, like Baldur's Gate 3, don't seem to be doing anything other than walking and standing.
Wow.
Alex, you looked at Dragon's Dogma 2.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to agree with this person to a certain degree. Obviously, I think that they targeted 30 FPS a long time ago, as part of this game because John played it. I don't remember how many moons ago, and he was like he already knew it looked like a 30 FPS game back then. And well, we haven't seen it too much historically. Either way, I think they targeted 30 FPS for a long time. But I think that they ran into issues at some point because not every game engine by default has like great, like persistent NPC support. And they probably wrote a lot of stuff very specific to this project. It's not like they had like a MetaHumans AI manager or something like that, like UE5 provides. So they had to make it for this project probably. And at some point they realized this to make our cities look like they're lived in with a lot of people, it takes the way we coded it, it's a little bit slow. So what do we do? And then I really do think like it was an ultra last minute. They can appear like they reduced the draw range on them to some ridiculous level to get the performance up. Because right now it is pretty comical when you play the game and you run through the city. And Oliver showed it off in his video where you run into invisible people and then all of a sudden they appear after you've already hit them. It is so, it's like, so that to me, because I don't think any developer of a game is like, I think that's the visual quality we should attain. I don't think they would have wanted that because they're competent. Look at the game. It's got a lot of competence written all over it. This is the one aspect to me that I think they ran into issues, performance issues based upon the architecture that they had made, and they had to scale it back quickly before launch. And I think they're going to try and win it back over a certain amount of time. And I imagine that that'll get better over time. If not, then it leads to a really interesting future for the game where like in 10 years time, you'll play it and they'll have like magically appearing NPCs, even though you're cruising along at like 240 FPS. It's going to look a little awkward, and there's no way to scale that in the game options on console or anywhere. So yeah, I think this game is next gen for a lot of reasons. RTGI's in there, but I don't think the AI thing is like the next gen aspect of it, to be honest with you.
John, anything to add to that?
I mean, Capcom has a good reputation for high frame rates in the RE engine, but this game is the first one they've made in that engine in this style with this large open environment and so many like NPCs. But I assume it's the way they've implemented how the NPCs are coded and like what it means to the game simulation, because like one of the key facets of this game is that there's a lot of granular interactions possible with actual like other models and enemies and stuff in the world. The whole climbing on top of foes and dealing with them and the way they do collisions. And I'm sure there's just some, they took, I think those types of NPCs and the way that the player can interact with them is probably more robust on the code side, but also maybe not as fast as it could be, because you can do a lot of things on screen, but depending on how you're doing it, it can be fast or slow. And I feel like whatever implementation they have here, it was important to them to get that sort of level of interaction and physicality and sort of collision quality. And I think they did a pretty good job with that, but it's obviously not fast enough versus, I mean, we all have to play Kingmakers when it comes out, but that was one of their big focuses, is like getting this, how can they do performant crowds, but also find a way to allow like granular interactions, like chipping armor and like breaking them down and having them react to the player, which I think is also what Dragon's Dogma is trying to do. They're just slower at it. So I think it's just that desire for the way they want players to interact with the NPCs and enemies versus what RE Engine has traditionally done likely created some sort of bottleneck issue.
I'm just looking at this quote from Capcom. In Dragon's Dogma 2, a large amount of CPU usage is allocated to each character and dynamically calculates the impact of their physical presence in various environments. In certain situations where numerous characters appear simultaneously, the CPU usage can be very high and may affect the frame rate. For May, put will, by the way.
Yeah, these mays.
That's the equivocation on some of this stuff is like not helpful. We are aware that in such situations, settings that reduce GPU load may currently have a limited effect. However, we are looking into ways to improve performance in the future. I think, we're kind of going back to design targets here. It's not just the the CPU utilization is very high, right? But it's also GPU heavy as well in some scenarios. So, ultimately the decision was made that, the overall performance target is going to be in the 30 FPS region. And, if it had a proper 30 FPS cap that functioned properly, that would be kind of okay, right? I guess the issue is that even when you're playing on PC, there's issues there in that, the most powerful CPUs on the market are barely getting you to 60 in these really heavy scenes.
Right.
That's why I would expect any performance patch to take a while, because it feels like they're going to have to do some pretty deep work in terms of how they're actually utilizing their resources to fix this.
Right.
Mm-hmm. There's also quite a lot of what you might call emergent gameplay in Dragon's Dogma 2. That's kind of what's really exciting about some of the stuff you see shared on social media. It's like, wow, this happened. And I suspect a lot of that is happening because of the more advanced CPU model, in which case you don't really want to stop that from happening. So, it's an interesting balance. Let's move on to the next question. And this is actually going to be a couple of questions rolled into one, kind of related to Dragon's Dogma. This one from some person. Why is it so difficult for developers to implement proper frame pacing for a 30 FPS cap? I thought you guys mentioned there is a system call on Sony consoles to have proper frame pacing. There is, and there is on Xbox as well, and Nintendo, by the way.
And
but
PC.
So many developers, and PC, yes. But so many developers seem to go with their own solution that has tons of issues. It's also not always an issue of having more compute overhead. Some devs, like From Software, almost seem allergic to proper frame pacing. Hopefully Armored Core 6 is a turning point for them on that. Are they just being stubbornly wrong? This one from supporter. Right, what's all this then? Why do some games have poor frame pacing? Could the industry ever adopt a frame presentation standard to resolve it? To begin with, all of the systems, as we just pointed out, they do have API calls that you can access, which do limit the frame rate, which do operate in multiples of the frame rate to give consistent frame pacing. The question is, why aren't they being used? And in some scenarios, in fact, in a lot of scenarios, it has significant input lag implications. We actually did a video where we used a patch from Illusion to enforce proper frame pacing on Bloodborne, and it massively increased the perception of fluidity in the game, but it did come at the expense of significant input lag. One of the arguments may be that a poorly implemented frame pacing cap that basically gets 30 frames per second out does actually have significantly lower input lag. However, I'm thinking back to when we did coverage of the original Destiny's beta, where we took Bungie to task on the poor frame pacing that was in that, and they actually fixed it, and they fixed it without significantly impacting latency, but it did take some time to implement. Anything more to add to that, John? Thoughts on this?
I mean, I think you're right on. You do need to do some work to fix that, obviously. It's funny, though, you mentioned Armored Core 6 at the end, because it's just a 60 FPS game, and I do see some confusion about this. Like, when we talk about frame pacing, it's usually because they're trying to run a game at a frame rate that's below the refresh rate, right? If you're at 60 frames on a 60 hertz screen, this doesn't come into play at all. It's only when you're, say, at 60 hertz and you're trying to cap it to 30, or if you're at 120 hertz and trying to cap it to 60, where this starts to become a problem. It's just how long a frame persists on screen. And I think, oh man, you're right. If you just use that system level command, I think it's by default like triple buffered across the board. And that does add a bit of input lag, though it's usually worthwhile, I think. But obviously there's ways to solve that developers can do, which I think would help a lot. But obviously so I think what's probably happening there is like developers like, okay, system call too laggy. they use a different method. Oh, the latency's good, but then the people doing the testing maybe perceptually can't see the frame pacing issues, right? So in their mind, like, okay, this is the better solution because the input lag is less, and then they just leave it and they never return to it, or they don't understand what's going on, or they double down and say, no, I want the one with low input lag, rather than how can we fix this and have both.
Yeah, so Illusion had a patch for Resident Evil 4 based on the same engine for the PlayStation 4 version, which enforced 30 FPS, and it was using the Sony system level call. So there is, in theory, no reason why Capcom couldn't have done the same for Dragon's Dogma,
Right.
but for whatever reason they didn't.
The one thing to say about that, though, is I remember the Switch ports of Doom and Doom Eternal from Panic Button and id, of course, they helped as well. I talked to them about this because those do have some frame pacing inconsistencies, and they were acutely aware of it, but it turns out there was actually technical reasons for it due to the heavy load being placed on the system and things that were happening in the background tasks in the CPU. Basically, there was no way for them to completely eliminate those problems, and it had nothing to do with the way they V-synced the image. It was just down to what was happening. Yeah, it was just an issue with the game running on the Switch that they were not able to fully solve, and it sounds like they did try, but it's just there's too much unpredictable stuff. There's stalls happening in the background where, oh no, I gotta wait, that's interrupting it in other ways. So they're still getting an average of 30 FPS on those, but like there's these little inconsistencies and gremlins happening in the background, which causes it to stall for just enough that you end up with these frame presentation issues sometimes. So there's definitely cases, I think, where that might not be feasible to actually get a perfectly paced image, but usually it is.
Okay. Any final thoughts, Alex?
Everything that you all said. Recently, I was just trying out Horizon Forbidden West on the Steam Deck, and I was surprised to see frame pacing issues when using the system level cap. And I was reminded that they updated the system level cap on the Steam Deck to have less input latency. Was this not a thing that happened? And I think this might be a consequence of it for games like John was talking about on the Switch. When the system is overtaxed, and the Steam Deck can be easily overtaxed because it's a low-powered device, that it can potentially disrupt frame pacing. And to see that, I was surprised because my memory of playing the Steam Deck with like when I did my Crisis video was like perfect. It was just like perfect. No issue. So I was a little bit interested to see that. Another thing is like when we talk about FSR 3 recently, there are gremlins that can cause that to have not proper frame pacing. And that's definitely something we're going to talk about probably when we do a whole nother video on FSR 3 in the future. But right now, like, it's not so clear cut, especially if you're not just using VSync. If you're doing VRR, for example, on PC, getting proper frame pacing is kind of easy, I would say, with VRR, because VRR kind of like just solves the issue for you. Yeah. It doesn't have to worry about flipping in the same way. But that's all I have to say.
Frame pacing, when we describe it in the PC space, can be quite different to how we describe it in the console space, where typically we're talking about frames being delivered in concert, in synchronization with the refresh rate, which is typically VSync. And you want to have the same level of persistence per frame. On PC, I'd say that most users, if they're not using VRR, FreeSync, G-Sync, they should be. And frame pacing basically means that whenever the frame is ready, it is presented, doesn't wait for a screen refresh, it generates a screen refresh. And at that point, if you're GPU limited, typically the frame currently being rendered is very similar to the one before, so you should get decent frame pacing if you're GPU limited, because the content doesn't actually shift that radically from frame to frame.
Right.
But obviously things, there can be, as you describe them, gremlins.
It's a great word.
There can be animation errors, which we talked about earlier.
Gremlins 3, the other new batch.
No.
The batch of badly paced frames.
The badly paced
frames. The bad batch. There we go.
Yeah, you can. When you're CPU limited, all things go completely crazy on frame times. It's not a good place to be. But yes, that's it. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Wide Boy Slim. Why is it that Sony has not made 120 Hz output and VRR with low frame rate compensation a system default? It is on Xbox, obviously. The difference in the perception of judder in Dragon's Dogma 2 is palpable. Why isn't it as simple as a developer flagging an option in the SDK as a core component of HDMI 2.1? Why are we bedeviled by such an opaque and chaotic implementation? John, you spend a lot of time complaining about VRR on PlayStation. What do you reckon?
Oh man, this is tricky.
We don't really know. Well, what we do know is there's a system level VRR function that only operates at 60 hertz.
Correct.
And games on PlayStation have to be manually set up to run at 120. So I still kind of think maybe they could do a system level VRR thing at 120.
An optional
games
toggle
that
for that.
support 120, but it wouldn't help Dragon's Dogma, which doesn't.
No, so that's the main problem. So basically the reason Xbox does it is just because it has that system level setting. If you set the Xbox to 60 hertz, by the way, that also causes issues because the floor is then raised. You don't get the same low frame rate compensation. It is key that you have to be in 120 hertz mode to get the full range. The thing is though, is you don't, at least for me, I don't always want everything to be running in a 120 hertz container because there's a downside to that. Mainly that if you're using a lower persistence display, you get a double image effect, right? If you're doing 60 hertz content in a 120 hertz container. So hold on, let me just drink some water here.
Don't die on us, John.
I'm gonna redo that.
I think the issue is we don't really know what the SDK features are available to PlayStation developers, but it does seem to be that there is one step needed to add, first of all, support for that 120 hertz output, whereas it's done at the system level on Xbox. And then there's kind of like, from what we're aware of, there's additional features that are available to developers who do use the SDK, but it's additional effort for one platform only, which is why we've only really seen it for the most part on first-party Sony games.
Right.
It's true. Yeah, they're not taking it seriously enough, annoyingly, because it is extremely useful.
You'd think a more holistic system level support for 120 hertz like Xbox would be the way to make it happen, though, right?
Yeah, it's just you don't always want your system to be in 120 hertz mode, or at least not everyone does. So like neither one has the ideal solution right now. So I feel like it...
Technically, the best one, it would be a per game list, and you set whether it's a 60 hertz or 120 hertz game. And this is something that actually annoys me on Windows too, is that you don't have the ability to like say, when I load up this game, other than the in-game option, you don't actually have a good control over the amount of like the refresh rate, the output refresh rate.
Right, exactly.
The one other thing that's kind of interesting about this is technically someone who's running their game, their Xbox in 120 hertz mode, already has the best input latency on console, which is a weird thing. Like, because if the game is even a VSync 60, the triple buffering is going to be lower refresh per trip, per each actual buffer. Like, it's a shorter amount of time. It's kind of weird that Sony, because they have already the Force VRR option.
So that's like, that was my idea that I just thought of here is like, basically, if you toggle VRR on, then the system should just do 120 output. If your display supports it, just force it. And it doesn't even have to be system mode. It can be like, if a game starts and it does VRR, it should just run at 120 automatically. If you have the toggle on. If not, then just run it at whatever the default refresh rates are, which is 60 or 120 depending on the game. But if you turn it on and the game supports VRR, or if you force it, it should just go into a 120 container.
Okay. There's a lot of sort of it's like a flow chart of conditions.
It's a huge pain in the butt for sure, and but right now the support is genuinely not good. I would say it only really helps in games that have slight dips into the 50s or native implementation. But if you don't have either of those, like, or like, it's really great for Gran Turismo 7 because that has the 120 frames per second mode, and you can still run it at native 4K at 120, but obviously it doesn't lock to 120. It's more like 90 to 100 usually, which is great for VRR. It feels fantastic. So that's an example where that really works. But yeah, in general, it's not good.
Last thing I have to say.
Let's go.
VRR is not a panacea. In a game like Dragon's Dogma 2, Oliver talks about it in his video, like even on an Xbox, it doesn't have an even look to every area you go to, because if the frame time is higher than if there's just enough frame time variation, regardless of whether it V-syncs or not, because it goes beyond a floor, like a refresh rate floor, it's still like variations of frame time that are high, even with VRR changing the screen, will not look good. And if you have an OLED monitor, I think a thing that actually happens is even if it changes the refresh rate on an OLED monitor, if it's a large variation, you can get like brightness differences in each refresh.
That can happen in LCD as well.
Yeah, but like that will also show up to your brain and it'll not look right. So like the whole thing is like VRR shouldn't be like the only thing that like makes you buy a version of a game. There's a lot of things to consider. Maybe some other aspect of the visuals will bother you there too, even while VRR is engaged. So like, yeah, there's a lot more to this than just VR.
Okay. Fair enough. Let's move on to the next question. This one from 1040 STF. Based on the leaks, could the PS5 Pro be powerful enough to open the gates to path tracing on console in games such as Cyberpunk 2077 or Alan Wake 2? And I would suspect not, but Alex, thoughts?
I would just say no, because AMD's, even their best stuff, like the 7900 XTX, they're like, they still struggle, because the thing is like the whole hardware accelerated angle of RT is not just like the way AMD does it. There are a lot of other things that make it allow it to be more performant on Intel and specifically NVIDIA here. So like, yes, maybe the new, which you keep reading a lot about stuff online, like maybe it can do hardware intersections of like the BVH boxes and the triangles faster. That's interesting, but that's not the only thing that like ray tracing involves and what makes it expensive. It's one aspect of that makes it expensive. But if another aspect is making it expensive, like path tracing, like with NVIDIA, for example, they made SER, shorter execution reordering, which allows, because path tracing is constantly like checking against materials and shaders for different types of objects all the time. And that messes up the, like essentially you can't do parallel work as easily on a GPU, which is a massively parallel computing device. It takes away one of the core advantages of having a GPU because the way path tracing works. NVIDIA came up with an attempted hardware solution to that has an entire API based around it. And if the PS5 Pro only upgrades like this one aspect, for example, of the way ray tracing is done, so more cores and it can do those rates faster, well, that doesn't approach the problem of like how much branching workloads there are with things like path tracing to the same way Intel or NVIDIA would do it. So it wouldn't make it any more viable necessarily. It would just have like maybe a slightly higher frame rate for like a slightly better frame time for one aspect of the ray tracing workload, but the other aspect would bog it down so much so that it's not really greatly playable. This is like, so like, that's why, for example, if you test out RDNA 3 in a path tracing game, versus its competitor, it'll show greater divergence versus looking at like an RDNA 2 friendly ray tracing implementation where it doesn't have to worry about all these things due to simplicity. Mm-hmm. So I would say I wouldn't expect it. I would be greatly surprised. I would be like it. But
I've got two answers to this question, which is, if you take a look at what 7900 XTX is doing with path tracing, it's not really doing the job, right? And I would suspect that 7900 XTX path ray tracing support is probably going to be more performant than PlayStation 5 Pro, simply by virtue of the fact it's got so many more CUs. So even if it is from an older architecture, just the sheer brute force extra power that the 7900 XTX should at least give you, like, at very best, a ballpark estimation of what may be possible with a much smaller part, right?
Right.
And, it's not really doing it particularly well. Maybe if there's like literally a game built from the ground up for PlayStation 5 Pro, possibly, but it's not going to happen realistically. And secondly, if you look at the developer disclosures that were leaked, basically what they're saying is, here's what you can do with ray tracing on PlayStation 5 Pro. One example is a game may have RT reflections and you can add RT shadows. Another example was a game may not ship with ray tracing on PlayStation 5, but could ship with it on PlayStation 5 Pro. In no way are Sony making claims that this is what has been referred to in some areas of the press as a quote unquote ray tracing beast. It's just better at ray tracing. That's the bottom line. And the examples specifically that Sony has given look useful, but not in any way like totally game changing in the way that we saw with Cyberpunk 2077 or Alan Wake 2 for that matter. Alan Wake 2, very heavy game.
Super heavy game.
Yeah,
my goodness.
As is Cyberpunk. Okay, let's move on to the next question. This one from Ricardo Rachhaus, possibly. Sorry, I'm so sorry if I got your name pronounced wrong. In the last Direct, you said about a possible business approach that Microsoft could take, which is to quote unquote license the Xbox for third-party companies to make their own version. If this happens, would Microsoft prove that the 3DO was right all along? John?
I mean, the 3DO concept was awesome. They were. I think Tripp was right about the idea. It's just that at that specific time, it wasn't monetarily viable necessarily. But then again, I guess the difference here is, so like, we're talking about making the Xbox more into a PC-like device, and that has different implications than a closed platform. The 3DO also had the issue that it was a closed platform, and that, the hardware makers, normally when you make hardware, you got to make their money back selling software, right? The whole blades and razors thing. And, Panasonic was licensing to do this 3DO manufacturing, gold star them. If they weren't making software, like, how did they make their money? They had to sell it for a high price, basically. And so I think today, though, we've seen like just the way hardware is sold and made and works, it's all pretty different now. And I mean, if you've got like Asus selling like the ROG Ally and all this types of hardware, they're also not really getting any licensing fees like a console traditionally would. And that's kind of the model we're talking about here, right?
Yeah.
Where it's more like the PC market. And I think also people are more willing to spend on these types of platforms now. Like when the 3DO launching for like $700 in the early 90s, that's a huge ask, especially for a non-established new platform. Whereas we're talking about a different thing here. I think
that only does one thing too. Like the 3DO did.
Oh, no. It did
multimedia, but
multimedia, video CDs, music CDs.
But like the ability to also take your Steam Deck, like you put it in and you put it out. Yeah. It's like a desktop PC at that point. That's huge. It's huge. So I think that's another thing. And also the stores at that point is another aspect that makes it kind of interesting. Why you'd maybe pay more for the hardware, because you realize you could get a greater deal on games because you have a variety of stores you can buy them from.
Well, I think he's just saying, though, the issue again is that the manufacturers if they were to like license this out and make a box, they wouldn't necessarily benefit from that. But that's already the case with PCs. So
yeah, I'm thinking back to a lot of the things that Phil said in that Polygon interview. Phil Spencer, that is. Basically, he's seeing an end to the traditional console model. The traditional console model is that they create a bespoke box which they take a hit on financially, and then they claw the money back via game sales and subscriptions and stuff like that. Phil is looking ahead. He's saying, well, this model, does it actually expand the audience? And he's saying no, because as all of the stats are now revealing, the size of the console market, is not increasing gen on gen. So he's saying, well, is this model actually working for us anymore? Is there a different model we can look into? If you no longer are subsidizing the hardware, then you no longer then you no longer need to create your own closed ecosystem with which to claw that money back. And I guess he's also looking, we talked about it last week, at the fact that, phone manufacturers, Apple specifically, but Google also, they're being forced to open their platforms. And it may well be the case that it becomes inevitable that consoles have to open those closed ecosystems to competitors as well. And so the 3DO model was kind of like not great because, it could be usurped by the traditional console model, which is, sell at a loss, clawback via game sales. And that model is in jeopardy at the moment. He also pointed out, of course, that the cost of making a console isn't coming down, which is like a profit center for the platform holder further along into the generation. And that isn't happening anymore. So the 3DO model is kind of coming back into vogue, if you like, simply by, the surrounding conditions. And I suspect what Phil may be hoping for is that competition from people building effectively the same device drives the price down instead. And then basically you have a platform that you can install any store on. And then it's basically a different proposition, a different type of competition. It's all about who's got the best, game store. On Xbox, it may well be the platform-specific features, because you're not going to be getting stuff like Xbox achievements if you're playing the Steam version of the game on your Xbox. So it's a different type of competition at that point. Mm-hmm. I think the thing that's really curious about this whole Xbox discussion is the fact that we're having it now. What is effectively the midpoint of the Xbox Series generation. Phil is starting the conversation early almost. So the 3DO model, it may well come to pass, but obviously we'd be looking to see greater competition to actually make the devices affordable. Yeah, interesting stuff. I think the bottom line is, though, that there are some high level discussions going on at Microsoft and possibly elsewhere, which is what does the games market look like in 10 years' time, and how do we get there first and command market leadership. Interesting times. Let's move on to our final question. This one's from Alan, he's big on the Discord. Alan, it's a big personality on the Discord. We love him. Okay, hello, Richard, Alex, and John. I don't like these mid-gen consoles. They seem to have damaged the generational cycle with the long cross-gen games. Sony doesn't need the PS5 Pro. Would it not be better to just have this generation shorter by a couple of years, then rather than extend it by a couple, extending the next gen? You can kind of see his point, right, John?
I mean, yeah, but I think the problem is fundamentally games aren't made the same way they used to be. They take too long to make now. And I think that is actually a problem in itself. But in the past, a new machine comes out and you'd have a lot of games within the first year, and then you'd already talking sequels and sequels to sequels, all within like a 4-year span, right? And that's just, now it's taking like 4 or 5 years for new games to get made. The investment,
we haven't even seen a new Naughty Dog game,
right? So PS5. It's so different from what it used to be. Like, I too love that old model. I thought that was awesome, but the big games, and a lot, even medium games, like just game development in general, takes longer than it ever has. And I don't think it's realistic to expect that anymore. And beyond that, with the way hardware evolves, it's no longer like the reason. In the past, when you had big shifts, it was because technology was growing so fast, and like they were able to implement such new things that were so fundamentally different from hardware that came before it. Those types of leaps, that doesn't happen anymore. So it's literally just like taking a lot of the same things that we've had for years now and improving upon it and adding in features. And if not every game even needs to take advantage of those features, or wants to, or is, right? So it almost doesn't make sense to hold it back from cross-gen, because it's not like the games it's not that the hardware is the limiting factor, or like, oh, it's a cross-gen game, so it's not. It's more the developers themselves and what they're technically capable of, what their targets are. Like, that's more the limiting factor. It's manpower more than anything else, and just time and money and all that, rather than hardware. I think just launching more new hardware wouldn't, like, what if the PS5 Pro, like he says, make it shorter? Well, that's also a limitation as to how fast hardware can even be made these days. Like,
Which
the
Rich
PS5
talked
Pro
about.
will probably be the best thing Sony could do at this given point. So what's the difference between calling it a PS5 Pro and the PlayStation 6? It's not that
because
different.
it's just a bigger GPU.
Right. I mean, they could have done more on the CPU stuff. They could have done more, but I'm sure that would also massively balloon the cost even further. Like, I think there's just a limit to what's feasible these days. And I think we just kind of have to accept that games are made differently. They take longer to make now. And yeah, I often would say, yeah, I'd be happier with lesser, smaller projects, but thankfully those still exist. AAA is not everything. There's a lot of games being made, and a lot of that stuff. Yeah.
Did the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X diminish the shininess of PS5 and Series X?
I don't think so, because the prior generation lived pretty much just as long, didn't it? And by the end of that generation, the PS Triple and the 360, but especially the Triple, that was not in a good spot. Like, the last half of that gen is real bad. There's a lot of really poorly running games out there. And I would actually...
PS4 fared better, though.
The PS4 actually fared shockingly well. And it turned out great in the end. And I think that's partially just due to the way the PS4 Pro was kind of upgraded in a very natural way to support higher resolution, but it wasn't so different that, like, if you were targeting a high-res Pro game, you'd basically be able to do the same on the regular PS4 at a lower resolution with similar performance. That's what we got. So I think it's just like these mid-gen consoles is just kind of like the reality of where hardware, software, and everything is at the moment. And if they said, no, we're just going to release the PS6 5 years after PS5, then, well, that would be next year. And
what if they didn't do the PS5 Pro at all, and then
that's what I'm saying.
2028 plan.
Well, then he's saying that would it not just be better to have this generation shorter by a couple years? 2028 would still be 8 years, so it wouldn't have satisfied that criteria either. It would be just as long, just without the mid-gen.
I think,
but I don't think the PS5 Pro is extending the generation.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
I think it's just an option for those who want higher performance. Yep. And I think maybe there was a damaging factor with PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, because they were basically an intermediate step that were attempting to address a 4K screen. And you got some pretty good 4K presentations, right?
Arguably better than some stuff we have today.
And so,
yes.
And so when PS5 and Series X came along, you know, the 4K shininess of it wasn't quite as pronounced, and it wasn't helped by the fact that a lot of the games, if not almost all of the games, were still playable on the Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro indeed. So, you know, that kind of natural sort of massive generational leap was less pronounced. I think it's probably the One X in particular was probably more damaging to Microsoft with Series X than the 4 Pro was to the PS5, because the 4 Pro was kind of underbaked, if we're being brutally honest. Whereas the One X was, you know, a simply terrific machine when it came out in 2017, to the point where, you know, what we saw with back compat was that it couldn't double the performance. The Series X couldn't double the performance on back compat on challenging games. It could only get so far. So maybe there was some element of damage there. But I think the mitigating factor is that ultimately those machines didn't sell a huge amount, the 4 Pro and the One X. It's like there was like an 80-20 split between them when they were available. So you probably wouldn't have had as much of an impact as we believe, simply because, you know, they weren't selling as much as the base consoles, which were a lot cheaper. Anything to add, Alex?
I don't think it's extending the generation. I guess the only thing is like the subjective feeling where, because they did all their if you didn't buy a PS5 Pro, then you don't you don't get that feeling. But if you watch all the marketing materials, like last gen, they switched over all the marketing at some point to just be PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. And then you found out what the base console was like usually when the game came out.
Yeah, Red Dead was the classic example where, you know, it was Xbox hosted the best and the worst versions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you do lose a little bit of like for example, now, like if they start showing all these PS5 games running on PS5 Pro with completely different image quality than the base PS5 version, which is just going to happen now because Sony's going to do that. And then the big thing they're going to show off next gen is we've got AI upscaling. Then it's kind of lost at that point. You didn't like have that like revolutionary, oh yeah, that's a big thing. So it kind of takes away like the subjective like feeling of generations. But on PC, it's been like that forever, and I still get excited about like hardware coming out. The pace is higher on PC. But, you know, I still get excited about new hardware as long as it's doing interesting things. Yeah, I think it's fine.
Okay, fair enough. It's all fine.
It's all fine.
Answer, Alan.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the final question, therefore the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share. If on the off chance you did enjoy the content, ring the bell for whatever things may or may not pop up on your phone or within your browser. Store.digitalfoundry.net to access our fine merchandising wares, including this Digital Foundry approved seal of quality t-shirt. Lots of new designs happening at any given point. That's all from us for this particular week. Hope you enjoyed the show, and as always, thank you for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.